I'm really happy to present the first panel of the University of Kansas Forum, and it's titled Mobility, Migration, and Community, with great panelists. The first panelist will be Hannah Alpert-Abrams with the presentation Surrogates, Repatriation. She works for the National Endowment for the Humanities. And secondly, it will be Kristan Hanson, PhD candidate on art history here at the University of Kansas. And Leia again, undergraduate scholar from the University of California in Los Angeles, who just won the paper award. Please welcome the first panel. The first panel will talk about how do digital media, data, and visualization technologies help us understand, tell stories, or address disparities related to the movement of humans, cultural belongings, and plants. Please welcome the first panel of the forum.
How about now? Yes. All right, great. Good morning. My name is Hannah Alpert-Abrams. It's true that I do work for the National Endowment of the Humanities, but I am not here. I'm here as an ordinary citizen, not a government official. But I did want to say before I begin that I am newly departed from the university system, and if any of you are graduate students who want to talk about alt-ac, you know where to find me. So I also wanted to say, since I am the first speaker today, I want to just thank the organizers for organizing this really incredible panel. And then, again, as the first speaker, I want to begin this talk by recognizing the indigenous populations who have traditionally lived and been displaced from and to Kansas, including the Kaw and the Osage, among others. And I had some slides with more information about land acknowledgements, but we couldn't get them up, so I'll tweet some more information later. So I don't have any slides today, which is unfortunate, but my talk is online, so if, like me, you have trouble following along just listening, I tweeted a link to the talk as well. Okay. So in 2016, Kelly McDonough at the University of Texas partnered with Lidio Gomez Garcia at the BUAP in Mexico to enact a repatriation project, the return of a 16th century map to the indigenous community in Cholula, a town about 2 hours outside of Mexico City. They did this by returning not the 16th century document itself, but a high-quality facsimile made from a digital photograph. I was going to show you the map, but I'll just tell you that it is part of the Relaciones Geográficas, which is a collection of census records made in New Spain in the 1580s. While the project was a Spanish and a colonial project, much of the work was produced by indigenous subjects. And I'll skip the part where I tell you about the map because, again, you can no longer see it. The map of Cholula, which I was going to show you, is held at the University of Texas. It was acquired along with other rare colonial Mexican materials by the librarian Carlos Castañeda, a Mexican-American teacher and historian, the first Mexican-American professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and fierce advocate for the rights of Mexicans in Texas. Castañeda fought the University of Texas over ethnic discrimination. He also stewarded the development of what is now the Benson Latin American Collection, which is where I used to work, but was then part of the Texas History Collection. I don't think it is a stretch to say that one aspect of why Castañeda valued this collection is because he saw it as part of his heritage and as part of Texas's heritage. But colonial materials never just belonged to one community. The Relaciones Geográficas were acquired from the family of the 19th century Mexican historian, Joaquín García Casbalceta. Balseta did not spill much ink thinking about whether indigenous communities deserved access to these records, but he was very unhappy about the fact that so many of the documents that recorded Mexico's colonial history had been dispersed to other nations over the tumultuous 19th century. For Balseta, these materials were part of Mexico's national heritage, and they belonged in Mexico. So the map of Cholula represents a conundrum when it comes to cultural heritage, because like many colonial documents, it belongs to many people. To people of Texas, people in Mexico, people in Spain, people in Cholula. As Jeanette Bastian wrote in her foundational work on post-custodial archiving, reprography, or the replication of historical documents, can serve as a solution when there are multiple people who all have a claim to documentary heritage. By making copies, we can distribute custodianship of historical memory to multiple stakeholders simultaneously. Archivists who work in the post-custodial tradition, like T.K. Sengwan, Teresa Polk, David Bliss, Itza Carvajal, have implemented this model as an approach where community organizations partner with large, highly resourced institutions to replicate and share their records. But it can also go the other way. Institutional custodians, like the University of Texas, can replicate their holdings and give them to affiliated communities in the form of a surrogate or a facsimile. This practice has received attention recently under the name digital repatriation, which is a term I'll return to at the very end of this talk. But I like to call it more generally surrogate return. Surrogate return has some advantages over ordinary repatriation. Repatriation, of course, is the return of cultural heritage to the community that claims ownership over it. It is usually enacted in a context where the holding institution acquired the materials through a violent colonial process, and it is viewed as an act of restitution. But there are times when repatriation isn't an option. Sometimes there is no single community that can claim an object, as we saw in the case of the Relaciones Geográficas. Sometimes the community does not have the resources to care for the object. And sometimes the holding institution is unwilling to part with a document that it may have acquired legally and that has become central to its collections. In these cases, surrogate return can be a good solution. We tend to think of this, We tend to think of this as a very new option, one that was born in the digital age. But what I have found in my research on copying technologies is that people have been thinking about how to use copies to resolve inequities in access to cultural heritage for a long time. So in what remains of this talk, I'm going to tell you very briefly about 3 examples of surrogate return that I've encountered in my research, and see if we can use these examples to extract some principles relating to the use of facsimiles as acts of restitution. The first claim I want to make is that facsimile reproduction itself is interpretive work. And so we have to be cautious about how inequity gets embedded into the repatriation project. So the image that you cannot see here is an 1851 transcription of a colonial era document. As those of you who work in the 19th century know well, transcription is how historical records were circulated among researchers. But inequities determine the quality of the transcriptions. The example that I had planned to show you was acquired by the Mexican researcher Joaquin Garcia Balseta. Balseta was unable to get copies based on the original, either because the costs were prohibitive or because political relationships were strained. So instead, he went through an intermediary. He wrote to the Boston-based historian William Hickling Prescott and asked Prescott to have transcripts made from his personal collection. Prescott's collection, in turn, was made up of transcriptions taken from collections in Spain and France. So you have a scholar in Mexico contacting a scholar in Boston who got all of his materials from collectors in Europe. The problem was that there were no scribes in Boston who were familiar with colonial Mexican Spanish. Instead, Prescott hired an Italian student who had passed through Havana on his way to Boston. The impact of the students' limited expertise is visible in Icaz Balseta's careful edits, which became the basis for his first printed edition of this historical record. So the printed edition that circulated at the end of the 19th century was based on a copy written by someone who didn't really speak Spanish. While we can't quite call this a repatriation project, we can see how inequity can become embedded in the very form of a repatriated surrogate. The second claim I want to make is that surrogates get old quickly. The second example I want to look at is a photostat copy of the Modal Maya dictionary, which is a 17th century dictionary written in Spanish and in Yucatec Maya. The photostat is a machine that was introduced in the 1910s to quickly and cheaply photograph large collections of documents or books. It's the first machine that lets us copy paper en masse, so kind of a precursor to microfilm. Special collections library, like the John Carter Brown Library, where I also used to work, used the photostat to circulate information. They also used it to resolve inequities to access. The Modal Maya dictionary was part of a large collection of Mexican materials that they had purchased from a Mexican historian named Nicolás León in 1896. León's financial precarity forced him to sell his collection, but his friends worried that the loss had impacted his ability to do research. So they decided to repatriate his own collection back to him by sending him photostat copies of the books that used to be his. They never actually completed the project, but in it we can see the seed of an idea that would become heritage repatriation, the idea that finances shouldn't prevent people from accessing their own nation's history. They were able to do, the people involved in this repatriation project were able to do a much smaller project by photostatting just one volume on behalf of Nicolás León and circulating it to multiple libraries. But that copy, too, had a shelf life. Unlike the Modal Maya dictionary at the JCB, which is still consulted today, the value of the photostat copy has dropped significantly as digital facsimiles have risen in prominence. And surely that, too, will change as we develop new and better methods for copying historical records. So to maintain a successful surrogate repatriation project, the JCB would have to continuously replicate the act of repatriation with new copies every time a new technology comes up. That would mean not just an ongoing commitment to the work of repatriation, but also a commitment to maintaining a relationship with the affiliated community or communities. Finally, I want to return to the map of Cholula for my third argument, which is that surrogate return is always political. After the map was presented to Cholula by the University of Texas, I visited the city and I spoke with Don Tomas, who was then the mayordomo, and others who were involved in the original return. They laughed at me and told me they didn't know why the map had been repatriated at all. You can get it online, they said. A facsimile copy had been available for years at the local university. A local artist had even produced engravings of the map, which decorated a local hotel. It's right behind the bar. It's kind of amazing. So I asked to see the copies that had been gifted by the University of Texas, these beautiful framed facsimiles, I was never able to find them. They had basically become private property rather than a community resource, although that's changed even since I was there a couple years ago. And in one case, it seemed that no one actually knew where the map was. But that's not the only story to come out of the Cholula map. Because when the map was gifted, the community in Cholula was in a land rights battle with the municipal government. The government was enacting an ambitious construction plan to make the city a more popular tourist destination. In doing so, they were forcing people off of their land and disrupting sacred traditions with long histories. Cholutecas love to tell you that theirs is the longest continuously inhabited city in the Americas. So drawing attention to the map, which showed that the same communities had occupied this land since colonial times, mattered in the context of this political battle. And so did the endorsement of the University of Texas, a prestigious U.S. institution. The politics of facsimile return weren't necessarily the politics of cultural heritage as we tend to think of them at all. It was the performance of the return and not access to the historical record that mattered in the context of Cholula. This isn't always the case, but it speaks to the importance of deep community engagement when enacting surrogate return. Okay, and then I added this bit at the end. So to conclude, I want to reflect briefly on the language of digital repatriation and the language of surrogate return. So in this talk, I've been using the word surrogate in place of digital and return in place of repatriation. I prefer surrogate to digital because although almost all modern facsimiles pass through the digital, with some really exciting exceptions, this is not a necessary precondition for the work of return and replication. And using the word surrogate allows us to think more expansively about what the digital can actually do, even when what we're looking at is a printed photograph or a 3D printed object, for example. I use the word return in place of repatriation for many reasons, but there's one that I want to highlight here at the end of the talk, just because it's something I've been thinking a lot about and I don't have an answer to. So I've been thinking a lot about the history of repatriation in the United States, which begins not with cultural heritage, but with the forced deportation of Mexicans and Filipinos in the 1930s. We use the word repatriation to talk about forced deportation. Many of the people, of the thousands of people who were forced out of this country in the 1930s, most of them were birthright citizens of the United States, and their deportation was criminal. So I've been thinking a lot about whether there are relationships between how we're conceptualizing patrimony and repatriation now in that earlier use of the term. Is it just etymological, or is there something deeper that can help us understand how value is placed on historical objects and who benefits from the movement of cultural heritage? And so I'm hoping that we can use that question to figure out what the word repatriation can tell us about questions of bodies, of justice, and of the future of cultural heritage. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Kristan Hanson, and I'm a PhD candidate in art history, and I'll be presenting a paper that grows out of research that I've conducted for my dissertation. Before I start, I want to take a moment to acknowledge Rhonda Hauser's help learning all of the digital tools that I needed to use to produce the maps that I'll show you today. My project examines the relationship between an extraordinary flourishing of the global ornamental plant trade and a concomitant bloom in the amount of painters who represented Parisian women and horticulture. Horticulture, the art of growing gardens and displaying decorative plants, was an extraordinarily popular activity in France during the second half of the 19th century. Parisian women embraced the practices of growing, arranging, and displaying specially cultivated vegetation as both a vocation and a leisure pursuit. In response to the sudden explosion of interest in horticulture and its tremendous impact on modern daily life, many Paris-based artists represented women with fresh blooms in urban green spaces. My project analyzes how artists explored the relationship between Parisian women and decorative plants, as well as their connections to actual locations in 1870s Paris. Jules-Émile Santin's The Bouquet Maker, Giovanni Boldini's Crossing the Street, Bert Morisot's Interior, and Edward Manet's In the Conservatory serve as case studies for examining the movement patterns of women and plants within distinct Parisian microgeographies. These geographically localized areas of Paris range from the prosperous districts surrounding the Paris Opera to the seedy pleasure quarter of Pigalle, and from the wealthy enclave of Passy to the proper middle-class quarter of Europe. These artistic engagements with Parisian microgeographies are significant because they show places at and near historically important outdoor flower markets and florist shops, in addition to landscaped parks, gardens, squares, and promenades. Moreover, the pictures thematize the sorts of sites that mostly women frequented in their socially sanctioned roles as flower sellers, shoppers, strollers, and domestic gardeners. The case study paintings also survey the different classes of Parisian women who practiced horticulture in specific types of spaces within the aforementioned microgeographies. Santan's The Bouquet Maker shows an elite, though working-class saleswoman at an upscale shop, and Boldini's Crossing the Street portrays a clandestine prostitute who carries a bouquet along a major boulevard where itinerant flower sellers and sex workers circulated. Additionally, Morisot's interior represents upper-class domestic gardeners in an upstairs parlor, and Manet's In the Conservatory describes a chic young lady who admires foreign flora in an artist's domestic conservatory. These pictures recall the remarkable yet understudied centrality of Parisian women in the French ornamental plant trade. Women were the favored laborers and customers of a horticultural industry whose business model relied on them to distribute perishable blooms. European horticultural networks reached their zenith in the 1870s, coincident with the founding of the French Third Republic, whose government promoted the growth of a mass consumer culture while advancing conservative social and nationalist policies designed to regulate women. I interrogate how French patriarchal structures not only shape the supply and distribution chains of fresh flora in global horticultural networks, but also inform the mobility of women and plants in Paris. A male-dominated supply chain of plant hunters, nursery owners, and gardeners provided trees, shrubs, and plants for display in civic green spaces, as well as selling on the private market. As I already established as a key part of my argument, the French horticultural industry relied primarily on Parisian women to distribute fresh blooms. For this reason, I use paintings of women in horticulture to examine societal beliefs about a perceived increase in female and plant mobility at distinct microgeographies. My interpretations of artistic engagements with women and horticulture expand on prevailing, albeit contested, beliefs about gendered spatial practices in later 19th century Paris. The utility of the separate spheres model is a topic of debate among scholars who focus on issues relating to women and gender in French history, culture, and society. While feminist scholarship of the 1980s argued that upper and middle class women were largely confined to the domestic realm in their roles as wives, mothers, caretakers of the home, and nurturers of plant life, more recent literature of the 2000s has sought to complicate, nuance, revise, and even posit alternatives to the separate spheres dichotomy. For instance, historians now agree that genteel shoppers, the working classes, and illicit sex workers walked in public urban spaces, and that societal dictates permitted women to circulate in the suburb of Passy, department stores and markets, and parks, gardens, squares, and promenades with minimal risk to their respectability. My project contributes new knowledge about female mobility to the field of women and gender studies by combining traditional art historical approaches with methodologies drawn from the fields of geography and urban studies. I use ArcGIS software to plot the locations that Santan, Boldini, Morisot, and Manet represented on an 1870 map of Paris. And I plot the proximity of these sites to a constellation of outdoor flower markets and florist shops. The resultant geospatial matrices articulate the relationship of the built environment to spaces and places where women moved non-native flora, bringing into sharper focus how artists responded to the impact of urbanization and global trade on the flows of women and plants. This map shows the distribution of roughly 40 florist shops operating in 1870 Paris. The mapping contributes new knowledge about female mobility in public urban spaces by visualizing a constellation of florist shops where a new generation of young women gained employment outside of the home for the first time, and upper and middle class women traveled in increasing numbers to enjoy fresh flora in their socially sanctioned roles as strollers and shoppers. In the bouquet maker, Santan's refined brushwork and rich jewel-toned palette convey the allure of luxury florist shops. Santan explored the centrality of women in plant distribution chains by showing an elite, though working-class merchant who markets a bouquet to an implied pedestrian shopper. Proprietresses hired this kind of young woman to staff florist shops, giving a new generation the opportunity to work outside of the home and greater mobility in public urban spaces. Santan's botanically accurate renderings of plants connect the store to two florist shops near the Paris Opera. Hyerarchies was located at 11 Rue Aubert and Maison des Bries at 8 Rue Neuf des Capucines. This map visualizes an area of the city that underwent urbanization to increase the flows of people and goods along a series of broad, tree-lined boulevards. Manet produced this large-scale painting entitled In the Conservatory in a rented studio equipped with a domestic glasshouse. Manet's vibrant palette and densely worked surfaces describe the fashionable clothing of a wealthy woman while also manifesting the sumptuous qualities of pink ixia flowers and frondescent palms. Native to southern Africa, the ixia was a bulb plant requiring a temperate conservatory, and it bloomed for only 2 weeks per year. Manet thematizes an entanglement of female and plant mobility by depicting the woman wearing a tailored suit with a pleated hem designed to promote walking, as well as fresh flora in portable pots. This map supports my reading of the kind of woman Manet shows as mobile within horticultural networks, traveling to the ritzy districts in the city center to shop for the most rarefied flowers and the latest fashions. Additionally, this map of Paris shows the locations of approximately a dozen markets that operated in 1870s Paris, expanding current thought about female mobility by visualizing places where women worked, shopped, and strolled, and their proximity to sites where artists lived, worked, and painted. In crossing the street, Boldini's scumbled tawny browns and dirty grays convey the gritty textures of a cobblestone street, where the Boulevard du Clichy intersects Place Pigalle. Saturated flourishes of bottle green draw our eye to a well-dressed woman who walks unaccompanied. Her raised skirt gesture indicates that she is a prostitute who passes as a shopper by carrying a bouquet. Female laborers sold flowers to other women at an outdoor market and from carts along the Boulevard du Clichy, a tree-lined promenade that served as the major thoroughfare for women to transport goods to the home. This map reveals the proximity of the Marché du Clichy to the corner of Place Pigalle that Boldini shows, as well as his studio and bars frequented by artists and prostitutes. The government of the early Third Republic encouraged genteel women to shop as a patriotic duty in order to spur economic growth, while endorsing conservative policies that sought to confine this same demographic to the home and quarantine sex workers to regulated brothels. In interior, Morisot represents upper-class women in an upstairs parlor of her family home in the wealthy enclave of Passy. Luminous applications of silver-green paint describe how a false palm grows in a decorative planter amid a mixed-species garden. Women residents of Passy purchased plants at an outdoor market, and they learned how to cultivate them from a master gardener at a civic nursery. These women also enjoyed relative freedom of movement because Passy was uniform in terms of class and gender during the work week. This map reveals the proximity of 3 homes where Morisot lived and worked to the Marché de Passy and the Bois de Boulogne, a sprawling park with spectacularly landscaped gardens. The map supports my interpretation of Morisot's painting as engaging with the French ornamental plant trade, whose exploitative trade practices enabled Parisian women to have privileged encounters with foreign flora at the Bois and in private dwellings. Drawing on Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's concept of the rhizome, I propose a new model for interpreting the connectedness of a thematic group of paintings to one another in a confluence of networks. The word rhizome is a botanical term that denotes, quote, an elongated, usually horizontal, subterranean stem, which sends out roots and leafy shoots at intervals along its length, unquote. The qualities that define a rhizome also make this kind of plant an apt metaphor for thinking about patterns of movement within a dynamic system, such as a horticultural network and an urban grid. the properties that characterize the rhizome, its uniplanarity, dynamism, connectivity, openness, and contingency, make this concept an apt metaphor for the flows that the modernization of Paris made possible. The architect and urban theorist Albert Pope studies such movement patterns in his writings on the industrial gridiron cities of the 19th century. Pope coins the phrase urban organization to describe the new relationship between the grid and the spatial field that resulted from the urbanization of Paris and other cities. For Pope, this modernizing process turned Paris into an open city whose grid promoted the flows of people and goods outward via a centrifugal system. Pope's theorization of the movement that the grid promotes invites analogies with the rhizome and articulates well how multiple forms of circulation, the mobility of women, the transport of plants, and the flux of images and ideas occurred within a single dynamic system. In conclusion, by drawing on the new knowledge generated by historical geocoding and digital mapping, and the evidence of paintings and other primary sources, I advance a two-pronged argument about artistic engagements with Parisian women and horticulture. First, I argue that paintings of this subject matter responded to male anxieties over a perceived increase in freedom of movement that women gained by participating in the ornamental plant trade within specific Parisian microgeographies. Second, I contend that these pictures illuminate how the conservative government of early Third Republic France enacted economic policies to revitalize Parisian urbanization and transregional commerce, promoting the greater mobility of women who distributed plants, while at the same time advancing policies that sought to confine middle-class women to the private sphere and quarantine sex workers to regulated brothels. Thank you.
So I'm going to start by thanking KU for including undergraduates as part of this important discussion. It's rare for undergraduates to participate in big research conferences like that, and I'm really excited to represent the University of California, Los Angeles, its English department, and its Digital Humanities program. So this presentation is really excerpts and different case studies that I used in my undergraduate senior thesis, which looks at digital storytelling projects of the Syrian refugee crisis. In the 9 years since the crisis began, over half of the country's population has fled seeking safety from the political turmoil within the region. Oh, is this a little tall? Is it easier to hear me now? Yeah. Over half of the country's population has fled the political turmoil within the region. That means that there is over 12 million people who are either internally displaced or staking their lives seeking asylum in other countries. Now, for a crisis that has gone on for so long, this leaves activists, journalists, and NGOs with the challenge of having to tell a story over and over that people have become desensitized to or just tired of hearing. And this is what brought me to my project. I was working with different refugee students when I was a community college student and at UCLA, and the different stories and narratives that they were hearing in news wasn't always quite matching the experiences that they had. And so I wanted to look specifically at how digital mediums are changing the narratives about the Syrian refugee crisis. So because of the longevity and the gravity of the Syrian refugee crisis, a lot of activists have taken drastic measures in order to draw attention to the issue. This is an image of Chinese activist Ai Weiwei, who, in order to draw attention to the crisis, decided that he was going to imitate the image of Alan Kurdi, a 3-year-old child whose body washed up on the shores of Turkey. Now, Ai Weiwei's image drew a lot of international criticism for being a crude and disrespectful imitation that not only appropriated the original image, but also a lot of the experiences of the refugees behind it. Ai Weiwei's mimicry draws attention to the ethical challenges of representing the experiences of the subaltern, especially when those experiences engage with a lot of trauma and a lot of these international challenges that distance us from the experiences of the refugees. It's an important question to consider when there's actually a corpus of digital texts that are being created by refugees themselves. The Syrian refugee crisis is actually the most self-documented crisis in history because Migrants use mobile phones. They use them to translate, to communicate, and in order to track their whereabouts, they often send images or texts to family. So there's a corpus of digital texts out there on the internet, but a lot of times these texts are being reappropriated into other forms. And also these texts aren't always in their original format. A lot of times other news organizations will take them and change them into new mediums. This ended up pointing me to a couple of different research questions. First, I was interested in understanding how do electronic literary forms affect diaspora narratives? Secondly, what happens when these narratives are told and read by digitally distant mediators? And as I was engaging with these questions, I wanted to look specifically at digital storytelling projects. These are projects that are created by and for the internet. These are important projects to consider because whenever they're often analyzed in conjunction with traditional forms of media, so print and news, but they're never looked at specifically for their digital forms. I wanted to look at how we could critically analyze them and see how these digital formats are changing the way narratives are told. I used a combination of digital design, postmodern and post-colonial theory in order to better understand what these texts were doing. And my project is now online at digitalsyria.net, which takes a look at the digital tools that were created. So as I was analyzing my texts, one of the things I realized was that my methodology was different than a lot of the things that my English classes had taught me. And it brought me to an intersection of two different digital humanities conversations that are out there, initiated by Catherine Hales and Alan Yu. There are two conversations, the first being that a lot of times we prioritize close reading practices that don't always translate well to digital mediums. And this happened with these digital storytelling projects because a lot of times these texts couldn't be read as a planar surface. When you do read them as just a flat text, you miss a lot of the embedded hierarchies that are being created. The second criticism is the idea that we need more cultural criticism within the digital humanities, and this has been a growing conversation. But I utilized both these conversations in order to drive what I call hypermediated reading. Hypermediacy was coined by Bolter and Grusin as the idea that we have to be aware of the medium. And so when texts are being created, it means that we are aware of the medium that is there. It's like with YouTube, whenever you're watching a video, you're constantly aware that there's an autoplay function right next to it. So you're reading with an awareness that there is a medium there. I wanted to read within this way because of two things: to acknowledge the constructedness of digital representations, but also to highlight the hierarchies embedded in digital texts. And in order to demonstrate what hypermediated reading looks like, I think that the best way to do this is by going through one of my case studies. This is a digital storytelling project called Searching for Syria. It was created in a combination between the UN and Google, and it attempts to frame the narrative of the Syrian refugee crisis through the world's top questions about the crisis. However, as we use hypermediated reading, we can see that there's a lot of embedded hierarchies that are filtering the narrative. And the first thing that I wanted to look at was the kind of concept of neutrality. Now, with a lot of these digital storytelling projects that are taking place on the internet, they rely on the pretense that the internet is an information network. And so it's more informative, data-centric. And so because of that, maybe more neutral and objective. So even the framing of the story, which is about queries, can also be challenged and changed. So the queries that were used to frame the project, which are said to be the world's most Googled queries about Syria, are actually only coming from the United Kingdom and the United States. I used Google Trends to track this, ironically. Now, when we look at what Syrian crisis-related key terms and where they're coming from, they're actually coming from a lot of other countries, countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. None of these countries and their queries were represented in the narrative itself. What this means is that Google and the UN are framing the narrative of the Syrian refugee crisis by saying that Western countries are controlling the epistemology of the world. It's saying that it can ask these questions, and that is how we're viewing this crisis. On a linguistic level, the narrative itself was in English, and it was translated to other Western languages, and only a couple months before the project was taken down was translated to Arabic. So there is also linguistic dominance there too. The other finding that I was looking at was the idea of immediacy and hypermediacy. So if hypermediacy is the awareness of the medium present, immediacy is the disappearance of that medium, so the erasure of it. And this is often used in order to put users in almost a face-to-face reality, which often takes place in the use of virtual reality. So this narrative of the Searching for Syria story was using virtual reality in order to take users back to Syria before the crisis began. Here, users were invited to visit Damascus in 360 degrees before the crisis ever took place and before this market was destroyed. So, when you actually enter the market, what you see is a virtual reality representation. But everything about this market, if you look at it through the lens of hypermediacy, demonstrates, again, a Western framework. So the text that is always constraining the user to this interpretation actually comes from UNESCO heritage sites descriptions. There's also voice overlays that, again, use those UNESCO heritage site descriptions, never the experiences of Syrian citizens themselves. Even the images that were used to reconstruct the 360 degrees experience were taken from a single Western tourist that had donated his images to a stock image site. These were spliced together in order to create this virtual reality experience. What this means is that not only is the user constrained to a Western lens impressed upon the market, but the images that he's getting is only representative of a Western tourist, which again shows how these Western frameworks are changing our interpretation of the narrative. The third finding is the idea that digital texts have afterlives. This is something different than traditional texts. It's what Wendy Chun refers to as the enduring ephemeral. It means that even as texts are taken down, they have lasting impacts on the internet. So this is an example of Searching for Syria. In August 2018, it had this site where you could go to different places in 360 degrees through virtual reality. But just a couple months later, it was completely taken down. So you can't actually access this project anymore, but because of internet archives like the Wayback Machine, there are still traces of these digital texts online. So this is an imprint of Searching for Syria on the Wayback Machine. But what it shows us is what happens when we break down those frameworks. See, the Wayback Machine functions by only taking snapshots of what has been most viewed, but also often the frameworks that were used to construct the digital texts. The only thing that exists now are these westernized frameworks of the UN dictating what we should look at. There are no longer any refugee experiences there, no more images, no more videos, and all of these have just completely disappeared. Now, as an academic, I'm thinking about how in the future, when there are students that are looking back into the archive, the only imprints that they'll have are these Western frameworks, no longer the images or the stories behind them, which is why it's important to consider how we're archiving these different digital storytelling projects when they're taking place in different kinds of mediums. The other finding that I want to look at are alternatives for ethical design. So this is an example of very blatant hypermediacy. This is an example of a refugee selfie that has two different layers of mediation. There's a photographer taking a picture of the refugees taking selfies, and then this has been changed into memes. Now, because those layers of hypermediacy were so clear, when this image got circulated on the internet, people were aware that people were interfering with the story. And as a result, the meme got criticized because people realized they're telling someone else's story and not understanding the full context. So if hypermediacy can work to just make clear who is doing these intermediaries, then I was wondering, can we use this for more ethical designs within digital storytelling? An example of this can be seen through Time Magazine's Helen's First Year. Now, I was tracking this project over time because originally it had taken place over social media, and this again has different problems about hypermediacy being used through different kind of Western prioritized frameworks. But as the narrative continued, they changed it so that way you could forefront the narratives of the refugees. One example is that there is always a toggle button at the top showing that this narrative took place both in English and in Arabic between the reporter and the refugee themselves. It's also a story told through the actual words and texts of the refugees. So there's a hypermediated sense of transparency. So using these different profile icons, you know exactly when the refugee is speaking versus when the journalist is speaking. And because it took place over text, they're making visible when the refugee is actually speaking versus when the journalist is interfering. What this does is it shows transparency who is interfering within the narrative and when those narratives are coming from the refugees themselves. The other thing that I wanted to look at was how we can reverse some of the hierarchies. So again, through hypermediacy, the refugees were able to take their own narratives through their own words and use their own images and interpretations of the refugee crisis in order to show their own narrative. This is critical because a lot of times digital storytelling projects rely on really advanced forms of digital media, but this is just through text, a very day-to-day experience, and so it brings you closer to the experiences of the refugee, but through their own interpretation. So in conclusion, I wanted to end with this quotation by Judith Butler, who is referring to war journalism. She says, "To learn to see the frame that blinds us to what we see is no easy matter." But I think through digital storytelling text, we can take the same principle. In order to understand and see the frame that blinds us, it will allow us to be able to see when stories are being interfered with and when they're taking place and removing the actual stories that are representing the experiences of the subaltern. This is critical if we want to challenge both the stories that are being told, but also how we archive them and how we can create better and more ethical alternatives. And so if we learn to see the frame that blinds us, this will allow us to have a more diverse and inclusive digital space that has more stories to tell.
Now, I open the panel for any questions, comments, and anything that you want to add up to this great panel. And if anyone has any questions, please come step in the front so you can use the microphone, please.
Hello. I apologize for my voice. I'm battling a cold. Thank you for such a nice presentation. I have a question for Kristan Hanson. Kristan, I was very interested with your theoretical framework of the rhizome and to think of mapping and networking. I would be interested to perhaps hear a little more on how you're connecting the digital tool of mapping and networking and the theoretical framework of the rhizome with the feminist and gender studies aspects. So if you could speak a little more to those three triangulated connections. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. To my mind, the scholarship on gendered spatial practices in 19th century France is sort of at an impasse where a lot of feminist scholars have been looking for primary sources authored by women, and then in the absence of those types of primary sources have speculated about women's mobility. And I realized that by looking at paintings from this period, and artists who are particularly interested in representing recognizable spaces, that might be a way to get at women's greater freedom of movement during this period, at a time when many male artists are responding to male anxieties over the perceived inability to control women's movement patterns. And I entered this, I guess, initially thinking through maps because I'm a visual learner and I need visual models to think through. And so I began making maps myself by hand to think through what might be possible in terms of understanding women's movement patterns and in terms of breaking down dichotomies of public and private spaces. So that's sort of how I entered the project. And I was doing a lot of work with a friend who is an architect who encouraged me to look at the grid as an open system that promoted movement patterns as opposed to thinking through dichotomies. And that's how I arrived at the rhizome as a way of thinking about not only the movement of women, but also the movement of the artworks that I'm studying and ideas all sort of happening at the same time through the urbanization of the city.
This is a question, I think, for Leia and Hannah. I was wondering to what extent you think the role of the archive is in your work. Do you consider your work as an archive, as archive adjacent, or how do you play with the archive in your work?
Easy question. Thanks for that. No, I heard you. I just said it was an easy question. What is the archive? We can all answer that. Can you hear me okay? My understanding is my talk was a little hard to hear, so. I think that, I'm talking pretty broadly about a lot of different kinds of collections, right? So the two projects that I described are from special collections libraries. They're talking about building, some of them are building repositories, digitizing materials in various ways, or circulating materials in various ways along a library model, but you can certainly do that work with archival materials as well. I have found that because I speak with both archivist communities and library communities, I'll say three things, and scholarly communities, there are overlapping but not always equating definitions of the archive among those groups. So I found that archivists think, when I speak with archivists, I try to be really specific and talk about the archive as a repository of records pertaining to individuals or institutions. When I speak and I differentiate from libraries, I differentiate from collections or curated exhibitions, right? When we speak with scholars, sometimes we kind of mix those things together. I think that those differences, as long as the community is clear about what we're talking about, they can be useful in different ways. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I think, for me, the role of the archive was more of an accidental introduction into my project, just because I hadn't been thinking about the longevity of these projects having afterlives, even after they're taken down. And so that's kind of the next step, is to see how do we think through avoiding a new colonial archive through internet archives. Like, how do we create archives that are able to take in context but also represent different stories than the ones that we're used to? And so that's hopefully my next step, is to look at how we're documenting and archiving all of these interactive story projects that are taking stories from other places, and also how do we avoid creating these frameworks that are more colonial and actually draw attention to the stories behind them.
What can I respond to that? One of the things that I thought was really interesting, one of the things that's really interesting about your project is you're talking about the production of these materials, but on the internet, which is sort of an unstructured space, right? But then you're also looking at these different structured spaces that are either intentionally archival or not, right? So I think that there's, some are sort of with a preservation focus, some are with a storytelling focus. You're really looking at a lot of different mediations. I think that is in really different purposes in terms of the longevity of the frame, right? I think that's really interesting.
Thank you. So since we're short on time, this is the end of this panel. If you want to have a better conversation with the panelists, you can do it during the break. Thank you so much for the questions and the attention that you all had with this panel.